He was just a regular builder hired to renovate an old house. But when he knocked down one wall, he found something that had been hidden from everyone for decades. What he saw inside made him immediately call 911, subscribe, and write which city you are watching from. Leon Hardy arrived at the edge of the quiet neighborhood just after sunrise, his old pickup humming softly beneath him, as if hesitant to intrude upon a place that had spent years practicing silence. The house stood at the far end of a maple-lined street, its silhouette slightly hunched, like an elderly figure who had been waiting too long for someone to finally knock on its door. The boards of the porch sagged gently toward the earth, the paint peeled away in long strips, and the windows carried the opaque sheen of glass that had not reflected a living face in a decade. Yet something in its stillness, in its worn and uneven lines, called to him with a faint urgency he could not quite explain. He had worked on dozens of old houses over the years, but this one felt different even before he stepped out of the truck. Leon had been hired for a simple job, at least according to the voice on the phone. The young man who owned the place, a certain Michael Dover, had inherited the property from an uncle he barely knew and wanted it cleaned up just enough to sell. Not restored, not modernized, just made presentable. Leon found the request odd. Most people who inherited a house, even a worn one, wanted to know its bones, its secrets, its hidden flaws, if only to understand what they were letting go of. But Michael spoke of the property with a strange distance, as though he were hiring someone to clear out the remnants of another person's life, and preferred not to know what those remnants were. When Leon walked up the porch steps, the wood groaned under his boots as though waking from a long sleep. He rested his hand against the weathered railing, his fingers brushing the rough grain of old cedar. The air smelled of moss and dust, but there was something else beneath it, something faint and metallic, like air that had been sealed too long. He had learned over the years that houses had moods, just as people did. This one felt watchful, as if taking stock of him, weighing him, deciding whether to let him in. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The first breath he took tasted of abandonment. The house had not been aired out in years. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows in pale, tired beams that barely reached the middle of the living room. The wallpaper had curled at the seams, forming delicate shadows along its folds, and a faint imprint of furniture long removed remained on the wooden floorboards. A cracked mirror hung slightly crooked in the hallway, and when Leon passed it, his reflection looked like a ghost superimposed on another ghost, the faded outline of whomever had last lived here. He set down his tool bag, listening as the house, uneasy at first, settled around the presence of a stranger. He began his inspection room by room, taking notes, running his fingers over walls that had once been touched by an entirely different set of lives. The kitchen cabinets were misaligned, the plumbing needed more than just tightening, and the floor in the back hallway dipped in a way that hinted at decades of ignored water damage. It was the kind of place that required more work than the owner realized, the kind of place with a past too thick to be wiped clean with a coat of paint. But what struck him most was the quiet. Not the normal quiet of a house long empty, but a deeper one, a kind that felt pressed into the walls. His footsteps seemed too loud, his breathing too intrusive. Even the wind outside was a muted whisper, as though the air itself had thickened around the property. On the third day, Leon finally began peeling back the walls. He had done all the preliminary cleaning, replaced several fixtures, and repaired a handful of broken floorboards. Now it was time to strip away the old wallpaper, to prepare for the fresh coat of paint Michael wanted. He chose the narrow hallway that connected the living room to the back rooms, thinking it would be an easy place to start. At first, the wallpaper came off in long, satisfying sheets, revealing uneven plaster beneath typical for a house this old. But in one section, just off-center and slightly lower than shoulder height, The plaster looked different, smoother, younger. Wrong. Leon frowned and pressed the flat of his palm against it. The surface gave slightly, not enough to indicate rot, but enough to tell him that something beneath it had been done hastily, with unfamiliar hands, not part of the original structure. He stepped back, narrowing his eyes. Construction from the 70s and 80s had a particular rhythm, a pattern in the way nails were driven, in the thickness of plaster, in how corners aligned. This section broke that rhythm. It was almost too perfect, too deliberate, an attempt to imitate old craftsmanship. But the attempt had failed in small ways. The seams did not match. The color of the plaster, though hidden under wallpaper, was subtly lighter. And when he tapped it with his knuckles, the sound it returned was a dull thud, different from the hollow resonance of the rest of the hallway. He tapped it again. Dull. Solid. Wrong. Leon had worked on enough homes to know when a wall was hiding something, and this one practically begged him to look deeper. He set down his scraper and fetched his flashlight, angling the beam along the wall. The light revealed faint irregularities, tiny bumps where seams had been sanded too quickly, patches where the plaster had been applied in uneven strokes. Someone had been in a hurry. Someone had wanted this wall to stay unnoticed, but had not cared enough to perfect the job. He traced the edges with his fingertips. There was no structural reason for a wall to be here, no adjoining room that required it. According to the house's blueprint, which he'd examined earlier, the hallway should have opened directly into the back room without interruption. This was an addition, and not a professional one. He called Michael to ask whether he knew anything about the interior changes, but Michael simply brushed it off, insisting the house had always looked like that in his memory. Leon doubted it. The plaster was wrong, the measurements off by a few centimeters. Someone had changed the hallway long after Michael had last seen it. After lunch, he returned with his tools. His instincts rarely failed him. If the wall hid something like mold, wiring, or structural rot, he needed to know before moving forward. But something in his gut told him this was not a repair issue. This was a concealment. He made the first cut carefully, scoring the plaster with a utility knife. The dust that floated into the air was newer, softer, not as dry as it should have been. He pressed his scraper beneath the scored line and pried the plaster loose. A piece broke off in a dull pop, revealing the unmistakable red of brick beneath it. Leon froze. Brick. In the middle of an interior wall, he pushed away another slab of plaster. More brick. Sloppy, uneven rows packed too tightly together. This was no load-bearing wall. This was an obstruction. His pulse quickened as he worked faster, removing enough of the top layer to expose the outline of an arch brick, arranged in a curved pattern like a doorway frame. The realization settled over him with a mix of dread and fascination. Someone had bricked up a door. He stepped back, wiping sweat and dust from his forehead. Why would anyone seal off a doorway? And why hide it under wallpaper instead of leaving it as a simple, unreachable space? Whatever was behind it had not just been forgotten. It had been deliberately entombed. The house seemed to shift around him, as if adjusting itself now that its secret had begun to surface. The hallway felt colder, the air thicker. Leon stared at the bricks, his breath coming slightly faster. He told himself it was just a structural anomaly, perhaps an old storage room someone wanted to forget. But the way the bricks were placed, the rushed workmanship, the attempt to mimic the surrounding plaster, all of it, suggested urgency. Fear. He grabbed his hammer and chisel, bracing himself. Each strike echoed through the hallway, unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. Dust filled the air in shimmering clouds, catching the afternoon light in swirling shapes. The more bricks he removed, the more the archway revealed itself, until he finally exposed the dark wooden edge of a door behind it. The door was narrow, old, the wood cracked and dry. The metal handle was rusted, almost fused to the wood. The sight of it made something deep in Leon's chest tighten. He could not explain why. Perhaps it was the stillness of the air around it, or how the metal seemed colder than it should have been, or how the door appeared too undisturbed, as though it had been waiting for someone to break the silence. Leon wrapped his fingers around the handle. The cold bit into his skin. He pulled, gently at first, then harder. The handle resisted, groaned, then gave way with a brittle crack as some internal mechanism snapped. The door opened a few inches, releasing a breath of stale air thick with dust, and something older, a scent that clung to the back of his throat. He raised his flashlight and pushed the door open farther. The beam pierced the darkness. The room inside was small, too small. Bare concrete floor. Dark foam padding on every wall, unevenly cut and nailed. A wooden chair with a tattered cushion stood off-center, facing a small table. On the table lay a stack of notebooks, their spirals rusted, their pages curled with age. In the far corner, a steel ring was bolted into the concrete floor. The metal was scratched, worn, stained. For several moments, Leon could not move. The beam of his flashlight trembled slightly in his hand as the truth seeped into him, heavy and undeniable. This was no storage room. This was no forgotten utility space. This had been a cell. The quiet of the house seemed to deepen, as though acknowledging that the time for silence was finally over. Leon stepped inside, the temperature dropping with each inch he crossed the threshold, and the door behind him creaked, almost in warning. He swallowed, lifted the top notebook from the table, brushed the dust from its cover, and opened it carefully. A young girl's handwriting sprawled across the first page, neat at first, then shaky in later entries. A name was written in looping letters. Hannah. Leon closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling the enormity of what he had uncovered. Then he took a slow breath, steadying himself. Whatever lay within these pages, whatever truth this room had swallowed decades ago, he knew with a quiet certainty that he would follow it to the end. Because he was no longer just a builder restoring an old house. He was now the keeper of a story someone had tried very hard to bury. And he intended to unearth every piece of it. The first night after Leon uncovered the secret room was one he would remember for the rest of his life, not because of any dramatic revelation or frightening occurrence, but because of the weighted silence that settled over him like a second skin. He did not sleep. Even after he left the narrow, suffocating chamber and stepped back into the hallway, even after he closed the door without locking it, even after he washed the dust from his hands and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cooling coffee, he felt the room behind him, felt it the way one feels the presence of another person in the dark. It stayed with him, pushing against the edges of his thoughts, as though the air itself had memory. By morning, the house had changed, not physically, but perceptibly. It no longer felt merely abandoned. It felt wounded. Leon sensed it in the way the floors creaked beneath him, and how the faint drafts slid along the baseboards, as if exhaling something old and exhausted. He wanted to pretend he had simply stumbled upon an unused storage space, something forgotten and irrelevant to the current world. But the image of the metal ring in the floor, the padded walls, the deep scratches that had nearly erased themselves into the foam, those things would not let him forget. He carried the stack of notebooks to the kitchen table and set them down gently, almost ceremonially, as though he were handling a fragile relic. He sat for a long moment in silence, feeling the shape of the day looming over him. He had planned to work on the kitchen cabinets that morning, maybe move on to the pipes under the sink. Now, those tasks felt like trivial gestures in a house that had just revealed its darkest truth. He reached for the first notebook and opened it, The handwriting on the first page belonged unmistakably to a child. Rounded letters, careful spacing, the occasional smudge where a pencil had been dragged too quickly. The name Hannah appeared at the top of the first entry, written with a kind of innocent pride. The date beside it was from more than 30 years ago. The early entries were simple, almost tender in their normalcy. Hannah wrote about school, about a girl in her class who braided her hair too tightly, about her older sister Eliza leaving for college, and how the house felt emptier without her. She wrote about her mother Rachel, describing her as soft like a sweater, and about her father Simon, a strict man who seemed to fill rooms even when he was silent. Leon found himself reading these small details with a strange ache in his chest. He did not know Hannah, had never heard her voice, but already he felt as though her words were reaching across the decades, seeking the audience she had never had. As he turned the pages, the tone shifted. The neat handwriting became slightly uneven, the pencil strokes heavier. Hannah described hearing voices late at night, low, tense, unfamiliar. She wrote about waking to a sharp bang from downstairs, and how her mother had refused to answer her questions the next morning. The descriptions of her father grew more strained. She wrote that he had begun pacing the living room, muttering under his breath, snapping at her mother over small things. There was a growing tension between her parents, something unspoken, yet loud enough to seep through walls and floorboards. Leon paused several times, absorbing the magnitude of it, imagining a child lying awake in her room, listening to the slow disintegration of the people who were meant to protect her. He remembered being young himself, how the smallest shift in the household atmosphere had once felt world-ending. What must it have been like for Hannah, whose home had not simply darkened, but twisted into something unknowable? It was the entry halfway through the notebook that made him set his coffee aside and lean back as though the air had been knocked from his lungs. Hannah described going downstairs one evening to get a glass of water. She heard movement coming from the back entrance and, thinking her mother might be in the kitchen, walked toward the sound. Instead, she saw her father dragging a man's limp body across the floor. She described the man's shirt soaked in something dark, the way his arm left a smear along the boards, and the terror that froze her in place when her father saw her. The entry ended with her father telling her she had nothing to worry about, that he was handling a situation, and that she must never speak of it. Leon closed the notebook, pressing his palms against the cover as though he could contain the horror inside it. He tried to rationalize, to imagine some innocent explanation, but there wasn't one. A child does not invent such an image with that kind of clarity. He opened the next notebook. The entries grew darker. Hannah wrote about her father's sudden obsession with watching her, how he demanded to know where she was at all times. She wrote about her mother's hands shaking, about whispered arguments behind closed doors, about a stain on her father's shirt that he scrubbed at in the sink before anyone else woke up. She wrote about how her mother hugged her longer, held her tighter, as though measuring time by embraces. Then came the entry that hinted at the end of innocence. Her father told her she had to stay upstairs, for her own safety. Meals were left at her door. Her mother visited only at night, whispering apologies, telling her everything would get better. But things didn't get better. Hannah wrote about trying to count the hours, the footsteps, the patterns in the wallpaper, anything to fight the growing sense that her world was shrinking. Her last entries in that notebook described the night when both her parents came to her room. Her mother cried openly. Her father told her they were moving her somewhere safer, that she knew too much, that he couldn't risk losing her too. Hannah described how she clung to her mother, how her mother kissed her forehead over and over, whispering something she could not fully hear. Her father led her downstairs. He opened a door she had never seen before. Behind it was the narrow chamber Leon had found. Hannah wrote, "I don't understand. He says it's safe. It doesn't feel safe. Leon pressed his hand against his forehead, breathing through the heaviness that filled him. He turned the page. The next notebook documented her days in the silent room. She counted the cracks in the ceiling, described the strange, sound-absorbing walls, wrote about her father bringing her food, but not looking her in the eye. Her mother's visits grew erratic, then stopped entirely. The last time she wrote about her mother, she described hearing her scream somewhere in the house, a short sound, then a thud, then silence. Leon's stomach tightened. The entries grew frantic, jagged, the pencil pressing harder, as though trying to break through the page. Hannah wrote about her father standing outside the door for long stretches of time, about the way he would open it just enough to slide in a plate and close it before she could say anything meaningful. She wrote about losing sense of day and night, about the way her breathing seemed too loud in the padded room. She begged the notebook to help her remember what sunlight felt like. Her final entry was short, almost a whisper on paper. He says tomorrow we... And the line ended abruptly with a sudden streak across the page, as though the pencil had been yanked from her hand. Leon closed the notebook. He stared at the stack, realizing the story was not just one of confinement, but of disappearance. A missing mother. A child removed, hidden, erased. A family collapsing under the weight of one terrible, irreversible night. He did not want to stop there. He needed to know what had happened to her, to her mother, and to the man who had built that room. He needed to know whether the world had noticed their absence or whether it had turned its head and moved on. He stood, grabbed his jacket, and left the house. The air outside felt painfully bright after the suffocating dark of the secret chamber. He drove to the town library, a modest one-story building with peeling white paint. Inside, shelves of aging books and boxes of archived newspapers lined the back wall. The librarian, who greeted him quietly, guided him to the archives when he asked about local history. He searched for the names Rachel and Simon Braidwood. It did not take long to find a newspaper article dated around the time Hannah's entries ended. A brief piece titled, "Local Woman Reported Missing." The description was sterile, almost uninterested. Rachel had left home one morning and not returned. No mention of distress, no speculation, no quotes from neighbors or family. Just a line urging anyone with information to contact the sheriff's office. There were no follow-up articles, no updates. Nothing. It was as if her disappearance had slipped from everyone's mind as soon as the ink dried. He kept searching. He found brief mentions of Simon in old community columns, donating to school events, attending council meetings, maintaining a reputation of respectability. But suddenly, a few years later, he vanished from local records. No mention of where he went. No note about selling his house. Nothing. Leon felt a heavy pressure in his chest. This was not a family tragedy the town had forgotten. This was a wound it had never cared to look at. He left the library and spent the afternoon knocking on doors in the neighborhood. Most people were hesitant to talk, their memories vague. But an elderly man named Howard invited him in and spoke softly about the Braidwoods. He remembered the older daughter going off to college and the younger one disappearing to live with relatives, though no one had ever mentioned which relatives. He remembered arguments, muffled and tense, and the night sirens flashed outside but quickly faded, leaving the neighborhood unchanged. Howard's voice trembled as he admitted, "We knew something was wrong. But back then, people didn't interfere. You just hoped things would get better." When Leon returned to the house, it felt heavier still. He walked to the secret room and stepped inside, the air cold enough to raise goosebumps along his arms. He imagined Hannah sitting on the floor, clutching her notebook, waiting for the door to open. Waiting for her mother. Waiting for something that never came. He turned off his flashlight and stood in the darkness, letting the silence speak. When he finally stepped back into the hallway, he knew what he had to do next. He needed to follow the only trail that remained. He needed to find Simon. Whether the man was alive or not, whether the truth was whole or shattered, Leon could not leave the story unfinished. The house had given him its secret. Now he had to decide what to do with it. And the next step was the one he had been quietly dreading. Seeking out the man who had created this room, who had sealed away his own daughter, who had buried decades of truth under plaster and brick. He would find him, and he would ask the question that had been echoing since the moment he opened the notebook. What happened to Hannah, the decision to find Simon Braidwood, was not one Leon made in a single burst of courage. It formed slowly, layering itself over the fear, the uncertainty, and the heaviness that now inhabited the house like a second ghost. By the time he awoke the next morning, still haunted by Hannah's final unfinished sentence, the decision felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. He could not unsee the room. He could not unread the diaries. He could not pretend he had stumbled onto a forgotten architectural anomaly, rather than the remnants of a life that had been stripped of freedom and swallowed whole by silence. As he stood in front of the mirror in the dim bathroom light, washing cold water over his face to steady himself, he found that his reflection looked older, worn down by the weight of secrets that were not his to bear, but now lived inside him. The house was no longer just a job, and he was no longer just a hired builder. He had inherited a responsibility he never sought, but could not walk away from. He spent the early hours gathering everything he needed. He photographed the hidden room thoroughly, its padded walls, its narrow dimensions, the rusted ring in the floor, the table with its faint dust outlines. He photographed each page of Hannah's notebooks, flipping carefully through the fragile paper so he would not risk damaging them. He documented the brickwork, the plaster that had been smoothed over it, the way the wall had been constructed to imitate the rest of the hallway. The camera in his hand felt heavy, and yet with each flash, with each captured angle, he felt as though he were creating something solid, something that could no longer be denied or dismissed by time. He printed a copy of the property's blueprint, marking the discrepancies, the measurement errors, the space where the room should not have existed. On a fresh sheet of paper, he wrote out a timeline based on the diaries, the argument Hannah overheard, the night she saw her father dragging a man's body, the growing tension in the household, the disappearance of her mother, the shift from isolation to captivity. Hours passed unnoticed as he pieced together the fragments of another person's horror. Outside, sunlight moved across the kitchen wall in slow arcs, dimming and brightening as the day turned over itself. But Leon remained bent over the table, driven by a mixture of dread and determination. When he finally loaded his truck, late in the afternoon, he carried with him only a small backpack containing the camera, a folder of printed photographs, his timeline notes, and 2 of Hannah's original notebooks. He left the others behind, locked in a drawer, with a quiet sense of reverence. The key to the house hung from a hook near the door, and as he paused to take one last look at the interior, he felt as though the house itself waited. Silent, heavy, bracing to exhale once the truth was no longer contained within its walls. The drive out of town wound through long stretches of farmland, where fields of brittle grass bowed under the steady push of the wind. The road shimmered faintly in the heat, turning distant telephone poles into wavering shadows. Leon's hands gripped the wheel with a tension he could not ease. With the hum of the engine and the monotony of the empty highway, his thoughts churned restlessly. He thought about Hannah, whose small world had narrowed from a childhood bedroom to a soundproof box. He thought about Rachel, whose disappearance the town had shrugged off without question. He thought about the neighbor, Howard, whose quiet guilt lingered like a warning. But above all, he thought about Simon. What he had done, what he believed he had been protecting, and what remained of him after all these years. He found the address through public records, tracing a faint paper trail left by Simon's attempts to disappear. It was a rented property several towns away, listed under a different last name, Bryant instead of Braidwood. The change was small enough to go unnoticed by casual eyes, but careless enough that, with effort, one could follow it. As Leon approached the exit leading to the rural outskirts, he felt his heartbeat rise into a steady pounding against his ribs. He reminded himself that he needed answers, not vengeance, not confrontation for the sake of anger, but truth. Truth strong enough to lift what the house had carried alone for decades. By the time the sun began to sink, he reached a narrow gravel road that led to a shabby single-story house at the edge of a cluster of pine trees. The property looked abandoned in spirit, if not in fact. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the siding mottled with bare patches of weathered wood. A sagging porch tilted under its own age, and the yard was choked with tall grass that rippled in the evening wind like the surface of a forgotten lake. His truck's tires crunched as he pulled into the driveway, announcing his arrival before he could bring himself to step out. He sat for several moments, the engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the front door. It was closed, but not tightly. The frame seemed out of alignment, allowing a thin bar of orange sunset to slip through. He wondered who he would find inside: a monster, a broken man, a liar, a coward, or merely a frightened father who had let his fear corrode every last scrap of good judgment. He wondered whether he was ready to hear what Simon had to say. He walked up the steps, feeling the boards shift beneath him, and knocked. At first there was nothing, only the whisper of the wind winding through the grass. Then, after a long pause, he heard slow, shuffling footsteps approaching from within. The door creaked open by only a few inches, just enough for an eye to appear in the crack, pale and clouded, but still sharp enough to hold recognition. Yes? The voice was rusty, as though unused for long periods of time. Mr. Bryant, Leon began, his voice steadier than he felt. My name is Leon Hardy. I'm working on a house that belonged to someone you once knew. A silence fell between them, heavy and assessing. Then the door opened a little wider, revealing the man behind it. Simon Braidwood, older now, his shoulders shrunken beneath a faded sweater, his once stern posture reduced to a frail stoop. His face was drawn, the skin loose around sharp cheekbones, the eyes sunken deeply into their sockets. But there was no mistaking him. Leon had seen enough photographs in the archives to recognize the man who had haunted Hannah's childhood. Simon studied him wordlessly, something like dread flickering across his expression. You're from the house, he said quietly, almost to himself. I hoped no one would ever. He stopped, as though the words themselves were betraying him. Then he stepped back, opening the door without ceremony. Come in. The inside of the house was dim, lit only by the fading daylight filtering through grimy windows. Stacks of newspapers lay against one wall, unopened letters piled in corners, and a thin film of dust coated the few pieces of furniture that remained. The air felt stale, as though the house had exhaled its last breath years ago and never drawn another. Simon moved slowly, limping toward a sagging armchair and sinking into it with the weight of someone who had been carrying his past for far too long. Leon stood for a moment, unsure whether to sit or remain standing. Finally, he chose a wooden chair opposite Simon, at a respectful distance. The silence hovered between them like a physical presence. What do you want to know? Simon asked at last. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from age, exhaustion, and something deeper resignation. Leon reached into his bag and placed one of the photographs on the small table between them. It showed the hidden room, captured in the beam of his flashlight, the padded walls absorbing all color, Simon's eyes flicked to it, then closed tightly as though struck. His chest rose and fell. Shallow. Unsteady. "You found it," Simon whispered. "You found what I buried." Leon tried to keep his voice neutral. "I found more than that. I found notebooks. Hannah's notebooks." At her name, something inside the old man broke. It wasn't a dramatic shatter, but a quiet, devastating collapse. His shoulders caved inward, and he pressed his hands to his face, shaking with a grief so raw that Leon had to force himself not to recoil. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt too small, too thin, barely capable of holding the weight of what hovered between them. When Simon finally lowered his hands, his eyes were wet, reddened. "I never meant to hurt her," he said, the words spilling out in a hoarse whisper. "I swear to you, I never meant for any of it to happen." Leon felt anger spark inside him, not the hot, reckless kind, but a deep, cold fury on behalf of a girl whose life had been stolen. But he held it back. He needed answers, not an explosion. "Then tell me what happened," he said. "All of it." Simon stared at the floor for a long moment, as though gathering the strength to peel back the layers of his past. When he finally began speaking, his voice was slow, halting, almost unbearably heavy. "It wasn't murder," he said. "But it was my fault. I made a mistake, an argument that escalated, a shove I didn't mean to give. The man fell," he swallowed. "He hit his head. It was over in seconds. I panicked. I didn't know what to do." Leon listened, every muscle in his body tense. "Rachel wanted to call the police," Simon continued, his voice cracking. "She said it was an accident, that it would be better to tell the truth. But all I could think of was losing everything. My job, our home, our children. I convinced myself that the only way to protect the family was to handle it quietly." He laughed then, a bitter, broken sound. "Protect? That's what I told myself. That's what I clung to." The story unfolded slowly, painfully. How he hid the body. How Rachel's horror grew into desperation. How Hannah saw what she was never meant to see. How fear twisted Simon into someone unrecognizable. Someone who believed that hiding his daughter was the only way to keep the truth from unraveling entirely. How his lies deepened until they no longer protected anyone but himself. He spoke of Rachel's death in a trembling voice. He said she had confronted him, threatened to take the girls and leave. They argued, she slipped on the stairs, and the fall killed her instantly. His words came out in broken fragments, and Leon could not tell where truth ended and self-deception began. He only knew that the man in front of him had lived inside this nightmare for decades. When he spoke of Hannah, his voice softened to a whisper. "She was too frail, too frightened. I saw her wasting away. I knew I couldn't keep her in that room forever." He paused, drawing a shaky breath. "So I took her to a facility, a place for troubled youth. They didn't ask many questions back then if the paperwork looked clean. I changed her name. I told them she had no family." He closed his eyes. "I never went back." The silence that followed felt endless. Leon's heartbeat thudded in his ears. He tried to speak, but his voice caught behind the turmoil rising in his throat. The knowledge that Hannah might have survived, even for a time, was both a relief and a fresh wound. He imagined her alone in a strange institution, wandering corridors filled with unfamiliar voices, waiting for a mother who would never come, for a father who would never return for her. "Do you know if she's still alive?" Leon managed to ask. Simon shook his head slowly. "No. After a few years, I stopped checking. I couldn't bear it. Or maybe I just refused to face what I had done." The answer landed with a dull thud, final and unforgiving. Leon stood, unable to sit any longer under the crushing weight of the confession. He felt hollowed out, scraped raw by the truth. Simon looked up at him, a frail man folded in on himself, not demanding forgiveness, not offering excuses, just sitting in the wreckage he had built with his own hands. For the first time, Leon understood that justice, in the legal sense, might never fully come. The crimes were old, the evidence fragile, the system ill-equipped to handle the half-decayed remnants of a tragedy buried under decades of silence. But there was another kind of justice, the justice of truth, of revelation, of giving a voice to the child who had been locked away and forgotten. He gathered his documents, his photographs, Hannah's notebooks. He walked to the door. When he opened it, the evening air rushed in, cool and sharp, carrying with it the scent of pine and the sound of rustling leaves. Behind him, Simon did not move. He remained in his chair, a silhouette of regret fading into the dim room. Leon did not look back. The drive home felt different from the drive out. The road no longer seemed empty. It felt like a path leading toward something he had not yet fully defined. The stars began appearing one by one overhead, distant and steady, as he rehearsed in his mind the steps he would take next. He would gather everything, every note, every photograph, every word. He would prepare a report, something comprehensive enough that no one could dismiss it. He would take it to the authorities, to the press, to anyone who would listen. He would ensure that Hannah's story, long buried under plaster and brick, would finally rise into the light. When he returned to the house, he stepped inside quietly, as though not wanting to disturb the walls. But the house did not feel oppressive anymore, not exactly lighter, but unburdened. Honest. He made his way to the hidden room and stood in the doorway, looking at the padded walls, the scratched floor, the empty space where Hannah had once waited. This time, he did not feel the room pressing against him. He felt it watching him go, acknowledging that someone had finally listened to the story it had guarded for so long. He turned off the flashlight and stepped back. The door creaked softly as he closed it, not sealing it, not erasing it, simply marking an ending. Tomorrow, the world would learn the truth. And Hannah, wherever she was, would no longer be silent. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe. Watch the next video and explore the others on the channel. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it.